everybody. Welcome to the Architecture Foundation's 2021 Book Week. We have a series of online broadcasts that we're putting together this week from the authors of recent publications relating to architecture. There's going to be 5 online talks involving some range of international contributors. And then on Saturday, we're also putting on an afternoon event with 5 further talks, which will also be recorded and made available online subsequently. But hope you could come along to the live event, which is at the Art Workers Guild. Information and the full lineup on the Architecture Foundation website. But my enormous pleasure to be able to introduce today a panel of people who've been involved in what is quite the most epic architectural publishing project of the year, if not for some years, which is, I've got 2 of the 7 volumes here. This is one of them, the Architectural Guide Sub-Saharan Africa. So there are 7 volumes in total. And this is a kind of series of publications which tries to offer a kind of a panorama of the architectural production of the continent, excluding the North Africa for reasons we'll talk about in a bit, I think. But we have 3 of the people who've been kind of involved in the production of this epic. Adil Dalbai, who is going to be speaking to us from Berlin, who's the managing editor of the whole project. Livingstone Mukasa, who's a Ugandan architect resident in New York, who's been associate editor, and Kuukuwa Manful, who has been responsible for leading the research on the Ghana section of the survey. And she is currently based in London, well, living in Oxford, where she's undertaking a PhD. Thank you so much for joining us, everybody. So I think we're going to begin with Adil and Livingstone. You're going to give us a little bit of a whistle-stop tour through the scope of the project, and I know you've got a PowerPoint to share.
So yeah, thanks, Alice, for the kind words and the kind introduction of our project. Yeah, we thought before we start the discussion, we want to give you a brief overview of the publication, which was edited by Philip Moise and myself together with Livingstone. And we started to work on this project back in 2014, initially with the idea of publishing 1 book, 1 volume. But over time it grew, and we ended up with more than 3,000 pages in 7 volumes. The publication is part of Dumb Publishers' Architectural Guide series, which usually cover individual cities or sometimes countries. But for this project, we went far beyond that, because we accomplished to cover the entire region of Sub-Saharan Africa and all its 49 countries. And just to give you an idea about the scope of the project, we sourced more than 5,000 photographs, and more than 300 authors participated in the publication. And in total, more than 650 people contributed to the project in one way or another, be it with their contacts, information about buildings, or photos, or assistance during our many trips to Africa. And as mentioned, the publication consists of 7 volumes. There are 6 geographically organized ones with an individual chapter on each of the 49 sub-Saharan countries. And what you can also see on the map, and what was already mentioned by Alice, that we decided to focus exclusively on Sub-Saharan Africa, which means we did not include Northern Africa for a number of reasons, which we can discuss in a minute. And in addition to these 6 geographic volumes, there's the first introductory volume, and its aim was to introduce the readers to the continent, its architectural history, and to discuss some of the more general or theoretical aspects of African architecture, or in fact, whether or not it makes sense to speak of an African architecture. And that's why we're very proud to have received 49 short texts and essays by accomplished architectural scholars and renowned practicing architects, including Sir David Ajayi and Francis Carré, for instance, who shared their views and ideas for path towards a theory of African architecture. That's what we named the first chapter.
Thank you very much, Alice, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you, Adil, for introducing the project. As Adil mentioned, this was a multi-year, multiple people project, and one of the goals was to highlight the multiplicities of the Sub-Saharan African built environment. The book was structured uniformly so as to give an organized way of documenting the architecture of each of the 49 countries south of the Sahara. Now, as much as the structure was uniform, the contents were not. There are no identical chapters. That's because there are no two identical countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. And even within a country, the diversity is quite broad. So the goal was to highlight the multiplicities of this built environment. Every chapter had local authors, local experts, and in most chapters, there was a coordinator who took charge of the overall organization and data collection. And it was really up to the country contributors to determine how best they wanted to showcase the architecture of their country. So the decisions made were very much at a local level. And the buildings ended up being a really vast exploration of the type of typologies one would find. For the most part, as you can see on the illustration on the left, a good number of them were governmental or institutional buildings, but they ran the whole gamut from educational to commercial to cultural to monuments, sports facilities, and also urban spaces as well. The book started off with an introduction, followed by a survey of what the local contributors thought were the most important buildings that would tell the story of the country's architecture through all historical eras. So the architecture that's depicted runs from pre-colonial through colonial, post-colonial, and in some cases talks about what comes next. What can we expect to see in the future? There were also longer excursuses and essays that went further in depth on ideas or thoughts that, again, the local contributors thought were important to go a little further on. Could we have the next slide, please? And speaking of the authors, we were very fortunate to have a truly broad assembly of architects, scholars, thinkers, artists, activists, students. And this represented multiple voices from multiple fields, all with a passion for Africa's architecture. For some people, this was their first time writing about architecture in their home country. For others, they were more accomplished. Some were published, some were professors. So the landscape of views was very broad and brought together a very exhaustive presentation, not only from the local level, but from the international level too. Some of these authors reside or are from places outside Africa. Many of them are from Africa's diaspora, which was very important for this project as well. Some were scholars and artists or architects with little local connection to Africa other than general interest. And that was important too. We also had people from as far as India and Australia as well. So it's really a global assembly of people who were really interested in letting the world know what this continent has to show as far as an architectural palette, an architectural history, and an architectural understanding. Statistically, 52% of the people that we see here are of African descent, which was an accomplishment that we're very proud of. And 20% of all of these authors were women too, which, given the statistics of women in the industry as a whole, was something that we're very proud of. And so that's a brief introduction of the book, the contents, and over to you, Alice.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Could we begin perhaps by talking, I'd like to ask you really about the existing literature on the architecture of this territory, of the continent, and how you saw this project as kind of moving on from what was already available. I mean, I guess the David Adjaye's photo survey of the architecture of the continent is kind of obviously one quite recent book which does have that ambition to describe the architecture of the entire continent. How did you situate yourself in relation to in relation to books that already existed?
Generally, when we started the project 7 years ago, we of course did some research and we looked into the existing literature, and our impression was that you could roughly split it in two categories, maybe, let's say. Of course, the scholarly academic research, which covers very specific topics, goes in depth, but yeah, obviously based on case studies or specific cases or historical examples. And also tends to discuss more problematic issues, of course, because it's one of the purposes of research to look at problems and possible solutions also when we talk about architectural research. And on the other hand, there was a lot of what we called some sort of exoticism narrative in more public media, where there were always some sort of safari lodges featured, or a bit more the catastrophic side of this, looking at hospitals, small school projects, which were definitely innovative, but give a very one-sided view of what we think is the entirety of architecture on the African continent. And what we thought was missing, something in between, or something that covers both these aspects, and gives more a realistic cross-section through the architectural production on the African continent, but also the existing built realities on the African continent or in Sub-Saharan Africa. And that's why we thought we would try to come up with something that covers all of this, and but at the same time speaks both to scholars and also the general audience, because we try to have this mix of academic articles, which we include definitely, but also very visually expressive photo essays, which are equally featured in the book. But maybe you can add to this, Livingstone or Kuukuwa.
Yeah, I also just want to mention, I just come in from someone just involved in one part of it, and then also seeing the book, I was a bit surprised to see get this huge box as well, as such an amazing breadth of work. And one of the key differences between this collection and what exists as well is the truly collaborative nature of it, and the extent to which Livingstone and Adil and Philip go to include a multitude of voices, diverse voices, not just including sort of, as he's mentioned, the more academic inclined and that, but even people at different levels of their careers. Because when I contributed to this book, I was just out of my master's as a student. One of my colleagues had just finished the degree in Ghana, and they really took pains to include different voices of people engaging with, thinking about, and living in architecture in their cities.
And
To
sorry.
add on to what Kuukuwa mentioned, it was important to have a variety of voices, but specifically voices that are from the region as well. When we look at architectural publications focusing on Africa, for many reasons, a lot of publishing outfits are based in the West. And for that reason, a lot of authors tend to be from the West as well. So there's always a missing voice. And that's a gap that we thought was important to try to bridge as best as we could.
And Adil, you mentioned that there was this decision to exclude this is specifically a Sub-Saharan African territory that you focused on. Could you talk a little about that decision? Why you felt that the north of the continent was a different condition?
Well, there's some pragmatic reasons for that, and some more theoretical, historical reasons. The pragmatic ones are because the continent it's so huge already. So obviously, to include North Africa would have added an 8th or 9th volume or 10th volume, and also some of the cities or regions, for instance, Cairo, Alexandria, and Tunis, already covered in other guides by dumb publishers. But more importantly, we felt that Sub-Saharan Africa was less covered. There's more literature, more existing literature on Northern Africa, and also in its entirety, there are more common aspects to Sub-Saharan Africa, which they share in the history of its architecture and built environment. And Northern Africa has its own very particular history with closer ties to the Mediterranean, to the Arab world, and therefore it has a different story. And of course, we're not denying the ties and the connections that ran through the Sahara at any point in history, also today, because it's not an insurmountable barrier. There will always exchange also in terms of architecture and knowledge. But we felt still it is, it's worth focusing just on Sub-Saharan Africa, because it has not been shown in this specificity and in this focus.
Could I ask about the primary sources that you were using, and I mean, I imagine that their availability differed enormously from country to country. I mean, Kuukuwa, I know that you're involved with the Accra Architecture Research Project, where you're building up a sort of digital archive of records of Accra's sort of early development, which I presume is sort of material that you've drawn on, kind of quite directly for what you've been contributing to the guide. And could you talk about what kind of material was available to you to kind of research the kind of history of Ghana?
Yeah, so at the time I wrote my contribution to this guide. That was the very early stages of what is now the Accra Architectural Archive. So I had just started to discover these building permits and urban history sort of collections or archives, as would say. So I drew on some of that because I did the introduction to the Ghana chapter, but I also had a section on pre-colonial architecture in Ghana, on which I drew on some of these archives. And it's partly also coming out of how difficult it was to find sort of primary sources on pre-colonial or very early colonial architecture that also spurred the rest of my academic career and has finally led me to be digitizing some of these and presenting some of these historical material. The Ghana chapter also has, sorry to be saying so much Ghana, but I am repping Ghana, also has this section by Hannah Schreckenbach, who is this professor who taught at the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology for years, and who's like just a great resource on traditional construction techniques and things. So I would even count some of the contributions in the chapters as primary sources in their own rights, because this is going to be sort of a record of the knowledge of some of these people that I have no idea how Livingstone and Adil and Philip found and got them to contribute.
And Adil, Livingstone, did you find there were some regions where that primary material, historic material was very thin on the ground, and the subject had to be approached in a different way?
Indeed, yes. If you look at countries like Sub-Saharan Africa's youngest country, South Sudan, this is a country that's only a decade in existence, and one of the projects covered in the chapter is the National Archives building. It's by Idwal Benny. It's a project that is yet to be built, but it's a very important project because its purpose was to begin the archival process for this very young country. Meaning that there are no archives, and the few that are in existence are not organized or housed in a single place, and in some cases it's really hard for anybody to have access to these multiple locations where archives are kept. So it was very challenging to not only find archives, but in the few cases where sources were found, there were questions on how accurate they were. There are a number of buildings, and Adil photographed one, for example, that had multiple architects listed as the architect of record, and the book tries to do a good job in highlighting what is fact from what is unverified. So it was extraordinarily challenging, and as Kuukuwa mentioned, we had to rely on the expertise of some of our authors who had I guess, more considerable knowledge than institutions in some countries.
And if I may add, then in some of the countries, also one of the problems is that these archives, even if there are archives, are colonial archives, and they're not located in the country sometimes, but in the former metropolis, like in London and Paris or Lisbon. And then the question is always, how do you use these sources, and how can we, in the book, for instance, if we use visual sources and images of historic and pre-colonial buildings that were shown in colonial depictions, how do we contextualize them, and how do we interpret them? Because clearly they show a very particular, very specific colonial view at these buildings and these cities. So this was another challenge that our authors had to face in many occasions.
And I mean, they said there's 49 essays, each relating to a country. The borders of those countries are frequently determined by colonists, and there's obviously a kind of pre-existing architectural reality that transcends those boundaries. That must be kind of shared. Architectural affinities between territories that have subsequently been divided by colonial rule. Could you? I wondered if could you talk about perhaps a little about those aspects of the architecture that the older architecture in the book that perhaps kind of transcends the national boundary structures which we see today?
Yes, and we decided to structure the book in these 49 today existing nation states, which, as you said, indeed, whose borders are based on colonial politics and decisions. But on the other hand, there's in many countries an emerging feeling of national, not just pride, but national conscience or architecture also. But for the more historic architectural history, we decided, because of course this is an issue we needed to reflect in the chapters, to include these essays and feature articles in the books, which cover topics that are not just specific to one of the countries. For instance, if we look at the Sahel region, many of the countries there, if you look at Niger and Chad, Mali, they share many common features in their historical architecture. So we have several articles in these chapters that cover specific aspects of the pre-colonial Sudano-Sahelian architecture. So maybe not, if you look just at the Mali chapter, it may not give a complete picture, but if you combine these, and if you and we were also careful to cross-reference always, if you look together at these chapters or at the volume that covers these countries, we hope that together they give quite a good picture of also those buildings and structures and this part of architectural history that goes beyond these borders that were clearly modern.
Could I ask about, I mean, I think one of it feels like one of the great potentials of what you've done is that it begins to set the stage for the protection of the buildings that that you're describing, that yeah, but just by through the pure act of sort of itemizing what's there, it becomes possible to think of this as a sort of heritage that needs protection. I imagine, forgive my ignorance, but there'll be different parts of Africa where the architectural heritage enjoys better protection than others. But could you say a little about about the current condition of how buildings are kind of protected in different regions, and if you think there's kind of a potential for those structures to be those institutional structures to be enhanced?
Well, looking at preservation, and that was a theme that kept popping up in the course of developing material for this book. A good starting point is the UNESCO World Heritage List. This is a listing of both tangible and intangible heritage that UNESCO, it's a status that UNESCO grants to projects that are selected by member states. But that selection process is very rigorous, and it requires a considerable amount of paperwork, a considerable amount of documentation and research, not only on the history of these sites, but their relevance to the countries. Because of that process, and because of the expense of that process, it requires archaeologists, it requires historians, it basically requires institutional strengths that many countries in Sub-Saharan Africa lack. Because of that, we tend to see, when we look at United Nations, when we look at UNESCO's World Heritage Lists, we tend to see them more based on European sites or increasingly more Asian, but very little coming out of Africa. So while we do have a lot of internationally recognized heritage buildings in Africa, they're few compared to the rest of the world. And that's because of resources. Many of these countries have bigger battles to fight with the dwindling resources that they have. One of the hopes of this collection of books is that it will help aid in that process. It will give those who want to nominate some of these buildings literature and documentation that they can now use as a starting point from which they can collect more or create more. Overall, heritage buildings are not well preserved throughout Sub-Saharan Africa. The climate doesn't help either, because it accelerates the process much greater than in other parts of the world. There are also deficiencies in the academic area too, where we're not training enough preservationists or archivists, and all these people play a role. Or even anthropologists, for example, and all these people play a role in not only identifying a building, but documenting its relevance. So hopefully this collection of work will aid in growing that industry to the point that we will see a lot more of these structures on heritage lists.
You mentioned that you have a number of kind of working architects kind of contributing to among the vast list of authors, and I wondered what among contemporary practitioners working on the continent, to what extent there's obviously kind of how we can. To what extent is the historic architecture of that you've looked at kind of feel kind of relevant and productive in terms of making a contemporary architecture in Africa today? That's a very big question. But are there particular practitioners who you can think of who are looking to the architecture of whether the pre-colonial architecture or the work of the 20th century kind of work that was produced, that it's informing current practice?
To speak of Ghana, West Africa more broadly, in the last few years, there's definitely been a noticeable shift towards trying to sort of reclaim inspiration from pre-colonial architecture and aesthetic more broadly. I can't quite put my finger on where this trend comes, but it's in sharp contrast to how we're trained. So how we're trained in most of the architectural schools across West Africa is to not really see our indigenous architecture as architecture. Their buildings, their dwellings, and these are legacies of the colonial syllabus on which most of these schools are founded. But in recent years, there's been a marked shift. And if we look at some of the more prominent, if we take David Ajay, for instance, you look at the early work, and then you look at some of the work that he's doing now on the continent, and you can definitely see a shift in sort of form and aesthetics, not necessarily replicating things, but you can see that there's kind of like a pride and an appreciation for certain form and aesthetic that's showing. You can take Francis Kere, who I would say has always had that in a lot of his work. Marian Kamara, who's relatively new compared to them, who also has this strong thing. So people just like taking these motifs, these forms, and these general aesthetic from grounded in wherever they are from and translating it into modern architecture.
Thank you. And I guess last question from me really is what do you think is, what needs doing now? Having made this enormous monument, what do you feel are the urgent areas of research or institutional development, or as you've said, Livingstone sort of heritage protection? Or what do you feel are the next steps for African architectural studies?
Well, good question. I think our hope was to, in addition to highlighting what this region gives to the world. When you think of architecture, it's the most visible form of art. It's the most visible form of expression. Everywhere you travel to, the first thing you visually identify is the built landscape. And that's what you remember too. Those are the spaces you navigate through, and they inform your sense of place and inform your memories of place too. But this is an area that has been so largely underdocumented for so long that it doesn't really register in the psyche of people's imaginations in the way that it should. When you ask people to identify, just a random person on the street, ask them to name 5 important buildings anywhere in the world, for the most part, Africa won't register, maybe with the exception of the pyramids in Egypt. So in addition to giving the general public insight onto just a really marvelous world of a different kind of architectural thinking and architectural expression that exists in Sub-Saharan Africa, also giving the continent itself a renewed sense of pride in the structures that they have, in the built heritage that they have, the traditions that have been lost with time and exposure to other cultures, giving rebirth to some of them, especially in today's era where we're talking about things like sustainable building, we're talking about climate change, we're talking about using resources that are kinder to our surroundings. But these are things that builders in Africa have always been practicing. They were onto this long before the world started to talk about it with urgency. But many of these things were lost. And so hopefully through this documentation, we can reconnect ourselves with traditions that are as important today as they were 100-200 years ago.
Maybe in addition to that, sorry, go first.
Finish, I'll take the last position.
No, I just wanted to add that maybe one of our hopes for the book is that, especially the first volume, in which we had these contributions by mostly scholars and a few also practicing architects, that these could contribute to the theoretical discussion about architecture in Africa. And as mentioned, the question, is there such a thing as African architecture? How would we define it? Where would we draw the boundaries? And what does it help to discuss this question for architectural practice? What does it mean for architectural education? And so, yeah, we hope to at least contribute a little bit to this ongoing discussion, to bring it to the next level, maybe in a way that giving it a more theoretical foundation, because we looked, some of the authors looked quite deeply back into history, or drew on specific theoretical concepts for their essays and articles, and overall, therefore, enrich this discussion that is often very superficial and ends at this question like, yeah, African architecture, yes or no, but there's more to it, and it's worth also looking deeper. Comparing also with other regions. That's why we included also comparisons, for instance, with Aboriginal architectural traditions in Australia or in Asia. Other local construction techniques is one thing, but also the post-colonial discourse, for instance, which has a very different status in South Asia, for instance, and in architectural discourses in this region. So we try to include these voices as well to bring this discussion, the theoretical discussion on architecture and architectural theory, but the African continent to a next level, maybe.
And yeah, just to go off on all that as well, there's a lot of room for deeper studies, deeper documentations of individual kinds of typologies, examples that are still, a lot has been lost, but also surprisingly, there's also a lot that just that still stands, that hasn't been touched yet. I personally never tire of finding the next book on 15th century architecture in the UK. And I could just listen to hours and hours of documentaries and things, but we don't have like kind of similar things for typologies and things in Ghana, where I'm from, in Africa more broadly. And there's a lot of material out there, and I'd like to see, this collection inspire more studies of architecture in depth, detailed case studies.
Kuukuwa, Adil, Livingstone, thank you so much for your time. I'd thoroughly recommend everybody to, first of all, reinforce their bookshelves, but then go to the Dom Publishing website and order the 7-volume set of Sub-Saharan Africa. It really, it's going to take me a few months to get through, but so far, so good. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.